Hello everyone, it's Robin the Delta Crafter and I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at a different way of using a die cut sentiment. We're going to use the negative or the reverse of the sentiment rather than the traditional die cut version. Let's go ahead and take a look at the products we'll be using today. We're going to be using a sentiment from the Naughty Reindeer set by Spellbinders. You can see there, I pointed to the sentiment we'll be using. We'll be creating a festive background using the Outline Christmas Bulb stamp from Simon Says Stamp. We're going to be doing some ink blending with 3 shades of Distress ink in Kitsch Flamingo, Picked Raspberry, and Festive Berries. We're also going to be doing some heat embossing, so we're going to need some VersaMark ink for that, as well as some white embossing powder. I've placed mine in a wider container for ease of use. Let's go ahead and get started making this card. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create our background. We're going to take this outline bulb image and we're going to stamp it onto some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock in the 80-pound weight. We're going to use our VersaMark embossing ink to do this, to stamp this image. And because the sentiment is longer, we're going to go ahead and use a landscape orientation for this card. So I've placed the cardstock onto my stamped image exactly where I want it to be. And I'm going to put some removable adhesive on the back of my cardstock and close my back of my MISTI onto the cardstock. And that's going to make sure that the cardstock is exactly where I want it to be. This will give me the image that I want to get for my background. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my Rabbit Hole Designs Cottontail embossing powder tool. I'm just going to rub some of this all over my cardstock. This is going to help prevent the embossing powder from sticking to areas that I don't want it to stick to. Next, we're going to bring in the VersaMark ink and I'm going to ink up my image so that I can stamp it onto my cardstock. This is a clear sticky ink that will allow the embossing powder to stick to it so that I can heat it up and create my image. And to make sure that I have good coverage, because this is a large stamp with lots of detail, I'm going to go ahead and ink this stamp up twice to make sure that I have good coverage of this image. Now that my image is inked onto my cardstock, I'm going to remove the cardstock from the MISTI and get ready to cover it with our embossing powder. So like I said earlier, I keep my white and my clear embossing powder in some larger containers, and I have little spoons in there. This allows me plenty of space to cover large images as well as keeping my embossing powder contained, and I create less of a mess. So I'm just using the spoon that I have in my embossing powder to cover my entire card panel, and I'm tapping off the excess. And everything went right back into my large container. So I'm going to clear that away, and now I'm getting ready to bring in my heat tool and melt the embossing powder. I always like to start and hit the back of my cardstock first, and then that allows me to kind of melt from the back, and then I move to the front and melt the remaining embossing powder. So now that that's done, I'm going to give it a few seconds to cool down, and then we're going to move on to our ink blending. So it's kind of going for a little bit of a candy cane kind of sweet treat kind of look for this. So I'm going to start with the Kitsch Flamingo, and we're going to start with our lightest color in the middle, and we're going to move our way out to the edges, adding darker and deeper color as we go. So I've got a good layer of Kitsch Flamingo down, then now moving on to the Picked Raspberry. And you're going to notice that once I start applying my Picked Raspberry, there are going to be some spots on the image that are going to be a little bit heavier than others. Don't worry, this is nothing to be concerned about. You have to keep in mind that dye ink dyes the paper. So what we're going to eventually see is that this ink is going to dry into the paper, it's going to settle, and it's going to even out. So now I've moved on to my Festive Berries, and I just want to add this just around the edge. I don't want a large amount of red on the final product, but I do want to make sure that I do have an ombre effect from the lightest pink to our red color. And as I always do when I'm ink blending, I go back through my colors and I go back down the spectrum to make sure that we have a good blend between all of the colors. So as you can see, I'm going back into my picked raspberry. I'm just going to go back over the area that I had picked raspberry on before and make sure to have a good blend into that red. And then I'll do the same thing with the Kitsch Flamingo into the picked raspberry. And you can see already how beautiful this all blended together. You can't even see those heavier marks that we had with the picked raspberry before. So because we ink blended over that white embossing powder, I'm just going to bring a towel in. I'm going to buff that ink that's sitting on top of that white embossing powder. I'm just going to buff that away. So it's going to make the white image bright again. And now I'm just going to set that aside and let it dry. But before I do that, let's take a closer look at our final background image. So while that background panel dries, let's go ahead and work on our sentiment. So I already know that I want to use these small etched rectangle dies from Fawn to cut out a panel that I'm going to cut my sentiment from. I like the little pierced edge detail that comes with this, so that's why I'm using these dies. I'm using a piece of mint tape to hold this die in place while I run it through my Platinum 6 from Spellbinders. This is the exclusive all black Platinum 6 that's exclusively available at scrapbook.com. This one has the universal platform system. I have a video where I've discussed this. The platform system, I absolutely love it. It takes the worry out of die cutting because it comes with a lot of different plates to use with different thicknesses of dies as well as embossing folders. So I'll be sure to link that video in the description box below. So now that I've cut the panel out with the pierced edging, I'm going to go ahead and use that sentiment from the Naughty Reindeer die set, and I'm going to place that into my my panel that I created there and die cut that out. Now, one of the things that I want to point out to everyone is when you're doing this technique, you want to save all the little inside bits and pieces that get die cut from your sentiment. Those you're going to need in order to make your sentiment read like it should. Because right now you can see without the little inner parts of the B, we can't really make what the letter out that is out in the word B. I'm going to use a piece of acetate to put a piece of acetate on the back of this panel in order to create a space and a place for all the little inner die cut pieces to attach to. So I've cut that piece of acetate down to the appropriate size for the panel, and I'm just using some double-sided adhesive. You can definitely use a liquid adhesive if you choose. And I'm just placing that acetate onto the panel on the back of it. And that's going to give us, like I said before, a place to put all the little bits and pieces from the inside of the letters. I do want this to stand up a little bit once we place it on our background that we created earlier. So I'm just going ahead and placing some foam tape on the back of that panel, this panel as well. I'm going to use the Artiste liquid glue, liquid craft glue. I highly suggest a strong liquid adhesive to secure all of your small bits and pieces down to your acetate. So I'm just kind of going behind some of those little parts and pieces that are attached to the panel, but also are sticking up a little bit. And this is where I kind of make my job a little bit harder than it has to be. I'm trying to take all the bits and pieces and stick them in place without any guidance. In just a minute, I realized that I probably should stick the die cut sentiment back into the negative and use the die cut sentiment as my guide. I'm going to figure that out in just a second, but a note to you all, don't make it harder than it has to be. Use your resources that are around you. Eventually I come to my senses and figure it out. So, but until then, I'm just going ahead and continuing to inlay these little pieces. And this is where I realize, yes, bring that sentiment back in, kind of lay it back into the middle, and that'll be your guide of where everything needs to go. See how simple that is? So now that I've done that, it's going to make it a whole lot easier for me to just go in and add some dabs of glue and be able to inlay all the pieces into the die cut. So now that I've gotten all the little bits and pieces inlaid into the die cut and attached to the acetate, I can pull that die cut away, and now we can see what's left. That's how we're using the negative or the reverse part of the image. So I put an acrylic block on top of that panel to make sure that everything has a moment to dry and secure and has a little weight on it to help with that. And now we're going to assemble our card. At this point, we're down to assembly. So I'm going to peel off the backers of the foam tape, and then we're going to place the sentiment panel onto the card base. So I picked it up backwards or upside down with my tweezers. So I twisted my panel, inked up panel around and attached it that way. Still works. And now that that is complete, I'm going to add some double-sided adhesive to the back of this panel and attach it to my card base. My card base is made from Accent Opaque 120-pound weight cardstock, and I'll have all of the products listed below in the description box for you. So once we get that attached to our card base, we're going to add just a few embellishments to this card, and then we'll be done. I felt at this point that the card was looking a little simple, so I brought in some Pink Fresh Studio gems in bubblegum. That's a beautiful pink color. I'm going to add a few of those to our card and secure those down with the Artiste liquid craft glue as well. Just putting a few dabs of that glue in place, and that's all that's needed to secure those gems in place. And with that, this card is complete. Let me know if you guys have started making your Christmas cards. Have you been bitten by the Christmas in July bug? I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Delta Crafter, as well as on my website, thedeltacrafter.com. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and hitting the subscription button. Until next time, everyone, enjoy!